Hello and welcome. Good morning. Today is April the 26th, and today we are going to talk about our new unit, the transatlantic economy, basically meaning the colonial empires of the various European countries. If you've looked, I did spend, I graded your DBQs. This DBQ is more difficult than others we do in this format because, once again, there are 10 points to garner in that. And what I plan to do, I already have another DBQ for this Thursday, and I'll put that in Canvas for this Thursday as well. And, it'll be our last one that we practice because it's just a matter of time to get those back to you. Trust me, guys. I'm not trying to torture you by, dumping these things for you to do on you. It's just that, May the 13th is the day. May the 13th is crunch time. May the 13th, your chance of getting college credit is all boiled down to this 45-minute exercise. And no, I don't like it, but yeah, that's the hand we're dealt. That's where we are. I did not spend any time grading your recording the grades from your little review quiz, which was only 60 points. There'll be another one of those Friday as well. I'm just trying to get you guys ready as best as we can. So, happy Monday. It is a nice day today. The good thing about having a rainy forecast ahead of you is that, it gives you reason to stay inside and at least pay attention to what you're supposed to be paying attention to. And I love films, but even I am getting, although I still advocate you watching that series on Masterpiece Theater, A World on Fire. It's pretty good about World War II. It basically concerns some family living in Manchester, England, who have connections with a family living in Warsaw, Poland, who have connections with a couple of people in France, who have connections with an American reporter who is in Berlin. And you just keep up with events of all of them. And for example, in the last episode I was watching, the woman in Berlin has made friends with her next door neighbors who are, upright German citizens, the American reporter, and she's made friends with them. Well, and remember, the year is 1940, I think, maybe 1939, 1940, just the beginning of World War II, and she's friends with her neighbors. And, it's a married couple, and they have a daughter. But the daughter is given over to having seizures. And they are very concerned about the very real possibility that the young girl will be removed from her parents to help her. Basically meaning they get put her on a truck and send her away to Dachau, to be honest, because this idea of this Nazi idea included purifying the race by simply removing peoples who were not deemed as going forward as being worthwhile. People with chronic health situations such as children who are prone to seizures, such as children with Down syndrome, and of course, homosexuals. You know, it was once again the most shocking thing about it was that this was an idea that was many people thought was cutting edge. This was the way to improve the lot of mankind. And anyway, let's where did I put? Oh, there it is. Transatlantic economy. Yes. Okay. Transatlantic economy basically deals with, and I hope you've pulled it up. Transatlantic economy is in your, if you look on in Canvas under assignments, it's right there, along with terms. Okay. Do you have it? Okay. European contact with the rest of the world has gone through 4 distinct phases since the Renaissance. The first phase was, it's called the discovery of the New World, basically meaning when Columbus tripped over the New World when he was out looking for India. And then the subsequent so-called explorers who then began to probe into this new world, looking for whatever. The second was the era of mercantilist empires, which is this unit we're dealing with. And that is why your video this morning is a discussion of mercantilism, a very simple, basic discussion of the economic theory of mercantilism. And we went over this before. Mercantilism was an economic theory that basically vested itself in 4 ideas. I think I have written down there somewhere, but in the beginning was that a country's power was tied directly to the amount of wealth it had, and wealth was equated in the amount of gold and silver bullion you could accumulate. 2, mercantilism, once again, is a zero-sum brand of economics. For me to gain, you must lose as a country. And so 3, then it talks about the role of colonies acquiring property and how the colony is supposed to be an entity that exists for no other purpose than to bring wealth and security to the so-called mother country. Mercantilism was the economic theory that pretty much all the European colonial powers adhered to, practiced, which then, of course, leads Europe into several wars. Lots of them. Okay. As we are at Roman 1, Part B, the second was the era of mercantilist empires, which we talked about in this chapter. One of colonial trade rivalry amongst Spain, France, Great Britain, also to a lesser degree the Netherlands, who tried to colonize, to a lesser degree Russia, to a lesser degree even Sweden. They generally existed, these colonial empires existed to foster trade and commerce, which led to the creation of large navies that fostered a series of naval wars at mid-century, meaning the middle part of the 17th century. This included the element of African slavery. Yes. This was the largest forced migration in the history of mankind, African slavery. We've been over this several times. Basically, 10 million people were absconded from Africa and transported to the Western Hemisphere in chains. Colonies from North and South America then emancipated themselves from their colonial masters, which is another unit entirely. The third stage occurred during the 19th century when European nations tried to carve out imperial empires out of what was left of the indigenous peoples of Africa and Asia. The last period of colonial empires occurred during the middle and late 20th centuries, which unfortunately we didn't get to go over. And basically, this was the decolonization of the world. All these old colonial empires, the British, the French, they began breaking up. In other words, the colonies began gaining their independence. What allowed Europeans to do this to the rest of the world was their technological superiority, meaning they had bigger guns, they had mastered the use of steel, and they had somehow either been able to dodge or utilize germs. By bringing germs with them, diseases with them from Europe to the New World, it really, it was just devastating. So anyway, what allowed Europeans to do this was their technological superiority over the indigent peoples, the native peoples of Africa, the Americas, and Asia. Roman number 2. Navies and merchant shipping were the keystones of the mercantile empires that were meant to bring profit to a nation rather than to provide areas for settlement. I mean, this is all part of mercantilism. The idea of creating these colonial empires was not to, oh, look, here's a place for our surplus population to live. It was, how much money can we make off these colonies? Even the 13 British colonies, a significant number of them were created simply as investments, beginning with the first, the Virginia colony. So, except for Brazil in the Western Hemisphere, Spain controlled all of Latin America and Florida. Latin America, that being anything south of the Rio Grande River. Britain controlled most of the area of the North American and Eastern seaboard. The French controlled the middle third of North America and many of the Caribbean islands, particularly Haiti, because of its sugar production. And once again, aside from chattel slavery, sugar, the production of sugar was the most profitable trading item, aside from slavery. The Dutch controlled Indonesia, which is Southeast Asia, or the East Indies, and a few other strategically placed islands and colonies like Suriname. Roman numeral 3. Mercantilism was an economic policy that dictated the actions of these empires. There we go. Look, there's the definition of mercantilism. Primary goal was to acquire gold and silver bullion, and a nation that amassed more gold and silver bullion was considered more powerful than its rivals. That didn't work out for everybody. For example, easily, the nation that acquired most gold and silver bullion in the early going of the transatlantic period was the Spanish, and they simply frittered it away. It was assumed that the wealth of one nation was assumed to grow or increase at the expense of another nation. Zero sum. My business must prosper at your expense. Colonies were to provide markets and sources of raw materials for the mother country and to not compete with her in any regard. I mean, to be real honest, the American Revolution was caused by mercantilism. Yeah, mercantilist ideas were always more clear in paper than in practice. Colonial and home markets simply did not fit each other, for example. Colonies of different countries actually wanted to trade with each other. The Central and South American colonies wanted to trade with the North American colonies, for one thing, because the Central and South American colonies paid in silver for goods, which is why, once again, in the United States of America, we use, am I touching my face? Yes, I am. Sorry, Dr. Fauci. Oh, did you see the Dr. Fauci skit? That's worthwhile viewing. It's actually pretty good. But anyway, that is why in the United States of America, we use the dollar currency as opposed to the British pound. because the British, during this period we're talking about here, intentionally created a currency shortage in the 13 colonies. I mean, it really was the reason for the American Revolution. I mean, all those wonderful things they tell you about, freedom and no taxation without representation. It was money, and that's just, I hate misrepresentation. So anyway, the British and French quarreled endlessly over the colonial empires, with the British supplanted by their superior navy, finally triumphing after a series of very costly wars. Their colonists fought over trading rights, property rights, allegiances with the Native American tribes. At the heart of this 18th century colonial rivalry lay in the West Indies, where the following commodities were grown in abundance: tobacco, cotton, indigo, coffee, and the biggest, sugar. The British East India Company and the French Compagnie des Indes dominated the trade in India. The original European footholds in India were, I'll fix that, were trading posts called factories. As time went on, both of these companies began to take the government control in some regions. You say, what does that mean? The two companies I mentioned, the British East India Company and the French Compagnie des Indes, they were these two large companies that actually, in India in particular, acted as on behalf of the British government and the French government, often using British and French tax dollars to do so. Roman numeral 5. The Spanish colonial empire was directed from the top and was also the first to fall apart. Governing the Spanish American colonies was assigned to a group called the Council of the Indies. Each of the the Spanish divided their big colonial empire in Central and South America into districts, very large districts, which today would be the size of several countries in Central and South America, called viceroyalties. And so the governing Spanish America was divided into the Council of the Indies. Each of the viceroyalties were divided into several subordinate judicial councils known as audiencias. They were led by officials called corregidors. The House of Trade in the Spanish colonies, Casa de Concesión, in Seville, regulated all trade with the New World. The Spanish intended for their colonial empire to simply be a pipeline, wealth going back to Spain and empty ships going from Spain to Central and South America, and Central and South American wealth going back to Spain. And that was it. The House of Trade regulated all trade with the New World. Its members worked closely with the Consulado, the Merchant Guild, and other groups involved with American commerce in Cadiz, a city in Spain. Each year, a fleet of commercial vessels, called the Flota, controlled by Seville merchants and escorted by warships, carried merchandise from Spain. And these transport ships would literally be carrying tons of silver, pure silver bullion. Carried merchandise from Spain to a few ports in America and brought back with them gold and silver. The War of Spanish Succession, which we just went over, and the Treaty of Utrecht, which ended, Treaty of Utrecht 1715, ended the War of Spanish Succession, ended Habsburg domination of Spain in favor of a new ruling family, the Spanish Bourbons. Remember that part of the provision of the Treaty of Utrecht, Philip the Bourbon Philip, the grandson of Louis XIV, is the new monarch of Spain. Under the Bourbons, Philip V, yeah, that's him. Spanish coastal patrols tried to suppress smuggling in American waters as well as piracy. Smuggling, Yeah. Smuggling between the Latin American colonies and the 13 British colonies, once again, was done so regularly that Spanish pieces of 8 doubloons, Spanish pieces of silver, were used as legal currency in the United States of America until 1859. That's how much Spanish silver was making its way into the 13 colonies against the law, but, you know, it was a better deal than dealing with the British. So, under Ferdinand VI, Spain's naval weaknesses were exposed, especially after Spain was on the losing side of the French and Indian War. Charles III did the most to reform the Spanish Empire. Charles used royal ministers and diminished the roles of the Casa de Contratación. He opened more South American and Caribbean ports to trade. In 1776, there's a date for you, he organized a 4th viceroyalty to govern the southern tip of South America, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia, and began to use intendants, spies, to make sure that things were in Central and South America were going the way they should be. These reforms brought the empire under more direct Spanish control, but many issues remained. And these issues will eventually cause all of the Spanish colonies in Central and South America to become independent of Spain by 1830. Peninsulares, who were brought in to fill the most powerful and lucrative government positions. Now, you guys remember, and I ask you a zillion times, you should know this, have it down cold, the triangle of hierarchy, social hierarchy in the Latin American Empire. Peninsulares, Creoles, mestizos, mulattoes, African slaves, Native Americans, and and the pyramid. Remember, so Peninsulares were brought in from Spain to fill all the most powerful and best-paying government positions. That caused a tremendous amount of jealousy from the Creoles. Creoles were people who were born in Central and South America, but they were of direct European descent. And they simply could not understand why the Spanish government insisted to keep sending more and more of these, these imports from Spain to run their country when they lived there. They felt they could do a better job of it. Okay, Roman numeral 6. Let us talk about chattel slavery. Of course, the work of the Americas and the profit of the Americas was born largely on the backs of slaves. Yeah, I mean African slaves. People who were stolen from Africa and brought over here. We talked about this several times. After the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453. Is that right? 1453. The Ottomans, rulers of the new Ottoman, well, not the new Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire, would not allow white slaves from their control regions to be utilized by the Europeans. And so the Portuguese first, they were the first, began to trade in Africa for slaves of African descent. And also the nature of slavery during this era also changed. Because once again, I talked about it several times. During the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance, there was slavery in Europe. But those slaves were normally household servants. And I'm not saying they didn't work hard, but they sure didn't work as hard as the chattels, the slaves who were rounded up from Africa, shipped across the Atlantic, and had to work literally from sun up to sundown in the broiling sun. uh, every day of their lives. And so the nature of slavery changed. I mean, in Renaissance Europe, the slave was kind of like part of the family. Yes, they did the work in the house, but they had a place to live and they were treated with some sort of decency. But the slaves who went from Africa to the New World had to do backbreaking labor, dangerous labor. And there's only one way that you make somebody do that kind of work when they're not getting paid for it. And the answer is physical violence. You have to beat them into submission. I'm telling you, histories can be so deceiving. When I was a kid, I used to read the Alabama history textbooks. And if you read them, it gave you the feeling that, slavery in the South really wasn't that bad. Everybody was, the slaves worked and they didn't feel bad about working. And that was a bold-faced lie. Anyway, back to the matter at hand, sorry. And it was because of the crops, because of the labor-intensive nature. When I was a kid, we picked cotton. Of the most profitable crops, slavery became the centerpiece of the colonial economies of the Caribbean, South America, and the southern British economies. Yeah, I mean, cutting sugarcane is very hard, and it's also dangerous work. Which African tribes were taken into slavery was a result of where they were located next to the coast and what tribal wars they were experiencing at the time. Basically, most of the slaves, the great majority of the slaves who were absconded, kidnapped, came from within about 200 miles of the West African Atlantic coast. And they were snatched up by other Africans. Only about 10% of all slaves went to North America. The rest went to the Caribbean because of the sugar, and South America. African slaves often surpassed the number of white people living in those areas. Therefore, to keep those African slaves docile, they beat them. They had to. Prosperity and slavery went hand in hand. New slaves were needed because the fertility rates of the earlier slaves were low and mortality rates were high due to overwork, disease, and of course, malnutrition. One of the key factors in the social life of many areas of American slavery during the 18th century was the presence of newly arrived slaves from Africa who brought with them their culture. Different nations dominated the slave trade during different periods of history. During the 16th century, the Portuguese and the Spanish dominated the slave trade, which was very lucrative, by the way. The Dutch ruled the 17th, and the late 17th and 18th century, the British and some French participated. However, make no mistake, all European countries participated in the slave trade. Why? Because it made serious money. Many of the so-called explorers, particularly the English explorers, Sir Francis Drake, John Hawkins, early in their careers, before they began pillaging and looting the New World, were slavers. So, slave trade, as you know, the so-called triangular trade, ships began in Europe carrying things like rum, gunpowder, muskets, went to Africa, traded those commodities for African slaves, which they packed to the gills, shipped those to the New World, where the ships were unloaded and then reloaded with whatever they were going to be taken back to Europe: sugar, cotton, tobacco, rice, commodities, indigo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There existed a close relationship between the slave trade and the wars in the African mainland, meaning that a lot of tribes in Africa made war on each other to collect slaves because that was lucrative. During the first 4 centuries of the colonial period, far more slaves came into the world than did freemen. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of an interesting stat. It gives you that, once again, it lets you know that most slaves went to Central and South America because during the first 4 centuries of the colonial period, far more slaves came into the New World than did free non-African peoples. There were always more men than women that were transported and survived the trip. Newly arrived slaves had to be seasoned, which is a nice word for beating the crap out of them. In the West Indies, there were far more people whose first language was African than European. I still have a very good friend who came to this country from Trinidad, and he speaks 5 languages, and one of them is a language called Umbra, which is a dialect from Africa. All right. Black slaves living in Portuguese colonies had the fewest legal protections. In the Spanish colonies, the church attempted to provide some protection for the slaves. Slave codes were developed in the French and British colonies. And these slave codes were, by the way, not so much to protect the slaves. In fact, they weren't to protect the slaves. It was just a code for dealing with slaves. So if the slaves tried to escape, cause trouble, etc., like that, they could be dealt with in a uniform manner. Although, to be real honest, the bottom line of the whole thing was that a slave was owned by their master. They were property. And you can do whatever you want to with your property. Slave marriages were not recognized by law. It was quite common to sell the children of slaves to other plantations. Also quite common to separate so-called wives and husbands to sell them if it deemed necessary. The children of slaves were also considered the slaves and the property of the parents' owners. And as we all know, in the case of Thomas Jefferson, the children of Thomas Jefferson were considered the property of Thomas Jefferson. Yeah. Anyway, talk about that for a while, but we won't today. Slaves often took on the religion of their masters, as well as their names. English-owned slaves became various Protestant faiths. Spanish, French, Portuguese slaves became Roman Catholic. Africans, also because of their native backgrounds, also became associated with mysticism. They brought many of their faiths, their mysticism-oriented faiths back from Africa. Europeans developed prejudices, especially against African blacks and slaves. And this was another new offshoot result of the slave trade. Prejudices against African blacks and slaves. Largely because, I won't say largely because, but it was significant that, since slaves did chattel labor and they had to be forced to do that labor, that put people from Africa and Europeans in oppositional positions with each other, obviously. And also, since, anybody with a brain could look at the practice of slavery and say, you know what, people who enslave other people, the things you have to do to make them work for you, I don't know, is that what Jesus taught? And so white people had to come up with some justification for doing what they did to slaves. So the image of blackness, the image of being of African descent, began to carry with it negative connotations. I mean, in our very language, for example, the use of, things that are white are considered better than things that are not white. And it's a connotation that comes from slavery. The image of blackness carried with it several negative connotations, all sorts of negative connotations. Evil, impure connotations that are associated with being not white. And yes, anyway, back to the matter at hand. Slave societies had existed before. They had. In fact, the United States of America is one of only 5 of those societies, however, where slavery was institutionalized. In other words, they had laws about it. Greece, Rome, Brazil, the United States of America, and Nazi Germany. Yeah, good company, right? Ironically true. But the image of one race being subjugated by another on such a large scale was unprecedented in history. Go back to that. Look at that again. Slave societies, in other words, societies that allowed slavery, had existed before. I mean, for example, in Rome, 1 in 3 people were slaves. But the Romans were equal opportunity slavers. You know, the Romans enslaved whoever happened to be convenient. Fact of the matter is, in the old ancient Roman Empire, most of their slaves looked like this and came from Eastern Europe. Remember where the word Slav comes from? Yeah, Slavic. But not to the degree as was happening now. The image of one race, that being the African race, being subjugated by another on such a large scale was unprecedented in history. And of course, to the short-sighted people of that time, they said, oh, well, people of African descent were made to be slaves. And they actually began to, one day we would talk about how the Bible was interpreted by one set of people. And I heard sermons about this when I was a kid, that a certain race of people, Africans, were intended to be in servitude. And the descendants of that institution still suffer the effects of that degradation. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to talk about this too much, but, so many people that I grew up with, and probably so many people that you grew up with, sit there and scratch their heads and say, I don't understand why it is that people of African descent in this country make up a large percentage of the roles of poverty. There must be something wrong with it. Well, what they also don't want to understand, is the simple fact that slavery, even after these slaves were freed, it wasn't like, okay, you're free. They were freed to be poor. When slaves were free, just like when we talked about how Tsar Alexander II freed the serfs in Russia, the serfs were now poor. They were just poor people. And particularly with slaves in the United States, because of that very obvious racial difference, it was easy to see, oh, this person was a slave. But also the laws of this country were then handicapping of the former slaves. I mean, they really were. If you look at the laws of the 19th century and early 20th century, the Jim Crow era, the black codes that existed, the purpose and goal of those codes was to make sure that African descendants could not gain economic power, could not gain political power. And so basically they hamstrung an entire race within this country. And I'm really rambling now, and I'm sorry. But yeah, that is why. The descendants of that institution still suffer the effects of its degradation. Roman numeral 7. Roman numeral 7. Wars of this era were, for the most part, civilized. And that was odd. Civilized meaning that, unlike today, wars of this era were armies fighting other armies. And when the war was over, it was just over. And you let it go. More like a game, actually. And did not draw to a great extent the civilian populations into the fray or the suffering. The Treaty of Utrecht, which ended the War of Spanish Succession, gave the British a 30-year asiento, a contract, so that they could sell slaves to the Spanish colonies. Very lucrative. That's why it was put in the treaty. The British also received the right to send one ship each year to a trading fair at Portobello, Caribbean port on the Panamanian coast. This allowed British smugglers an inroad into the rich Spanish trade routes. During one such event, there was a skirmish, and a British captain named Robert Jenkins had his ear cut off, which he subsequently kept in a jar of brandy to preserve it. And he later served in Parliament and said, you know, this is what the Spanish did to me. And it was called the War of Jenkins Ear. In 1739, the British went to war with Spain, War of Jenkins Ear, and this became the opening round of several European wars of balance that would engulf Europe until 1815. Okay. The War of Austrian Succession began with Frederick II of Prussia seized the province of Silesia. Silesia is actually today in modern-day Poland. In clear violation of the Pragmatic Sanction. Pragmatic Sanction, the Pragmatic Sanction was an agreement that all the monarchs of Europe signed, basically saying that when Emperor Leopold of Austria had died, that all of the countries of Europe would respect the right of his daughter, Maria Theresa, to be the monarch of Austria. And as soon as the guy died, this guy, Frederick II of Prussia, who never liked his own father, said, my father signed that, I didn't sign it. Therefore, we're taking Silesia. So, this could have begun a feeding frenzy of revolts in the Habsburg Empire of Austria, but somehow Maria Theresa, interesting woman. Maria Theresa had 12 children, and she outlived all of them, but I think maybe 4. She was the mother of Marie Antoinette, also the mother of Joseph II, the most liberal of the Enlightenment monarchs. And so, yeah, but Maria Theresa was able to hold her empire together. She was able to hold her empire together by granting new privileges to her own nobility. She also gave recognition to Hungary as the most important of the Austrian provinces. France joined in on the side of Prussia, and Prussia was normally the French enemy to oppose Austria, and because France wanted to snatch up some Austrian territory, Britain joined Austria to oppose France. Balance of power. Not because the British cared about Maria Theresa, not because the British wanted to make sure France didn't become too powerful. They wanted to make sure that the Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, of course, Belgium didn't exist then, neither did Luxembourg, did not fall into French hands. The war ended in stalemate with the Treaty of La Capelle, in which only Prussia gained territory, that being Silesia. And meaning that of all the countries involved in the war, Prussia won because they got to keep Silesia. Britain won because they maintained the balance of power. The diplomatic revolution was simply a series of nations suddenly changing sides to suit their own ends and to maintain the balance of power. Britain signed a pact with Prussia to keep foreign troops out of Germany at the Convention of Westminster. France and Austria also signed a defensive alliance right after they'd fought a war. Part of that alliance ended up with Marie Antoinette going off and marrying Louis XVI. Frederick II initiated hostilities that would lead to a colonial war that became known as the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, which lasted 1756-1763. Frederick II got involved in the French and Indian War, sent his troops into Saxony, a district in what is now Germany, as a preemptive strike. France and Austria then made a new alliance whose goal was the destruction of Prussia. After this war, Frederick II became known as Frederick the Great. Britain furnished considerable financial aid to the Prussians, and that was important because during the French and Indian War, the British were losing the Americas, but the British gave money to Prussia so they could keep France tied down in Europe, while the British took care of things in North America. The new Tsar of Russia, Peter III, the one who ends up marrying Catherine the Great, and she ends up having him murdered by Gregory Orlov. Peter III was a great admirer of Frederick the Great, and he actually pulled back. I mean, Peter III was really, really one of those examples of an unstable Russian czar. Russian armies were at the gates of Berlin. They were about to take over Berlin, and the Prussians were going to be knocked out of the war. But because Peter III, Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, was his idol, he said, maybe we'll just pull back. And that angered a lot of Russian soldiers who had, lost their lives in this war. And they, one night, they took Peter III and they literally beat him to death. And the story went back that he had died of some fever or something, but he had been murdered. The Treaty of Hubertusburg ended the European of the war and made Frederick II look like a genius. Sir William Pitt is given credit for winning the French and Indian War. He pumped large amounts of money into the Prussian war effort, thus keeping France tied down in Europe and not in the colonies. He also sent 40,000 regular English and colonial troops against the French in Canada, and he also cooperated on a much higher level with the colonial leaders. Sale from captured French sugar helped finance the British war effort. Between 1755 and 1760, French colonial trade fell by more than 80%, meaning they didn't have money for the war. In India, remember that the war is going on in North America, it's going on in Europe, and it's also going on in India. Between 1755 and 1760, in India, Robert Clive led British forces to victory at the Battle of Plassey, which was the last major battle that you actually see the involvement of elephants. Yeah. Never had any European country, the British, ever achieved such a major worldwide victory. And always more important than wars are peace treaties. The Treaty of Paris ended with the colonial theater of the war and was less of a victory. What that means is this. Treaty of Paris. Treaty of Paris of 1763 ends the French and Indian War. Terms. Basically four. The French had to give to Great Britain, now get this, all of the Ohio Valley, which once again stretches basically from right where we are right now to the Great Lakes. They also had to give them the rest of Canada. 2, the French gave Louisiana, which Louisiana is not the state. Louisiana is the middle third of the United States of America, from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. The French gave that to Spain because the French by this time were like, we're just done with this whole colonial business. 3, the French also gave up all claim to India to Great Britain. And finally, 4, the Spanish, because they had helped the French and because they were losers in the war, had to give Florida to Great Britain, making this, the Treaty of Paris 1763, the biggest land swap, the biggest land exchange in the history of mankind. And Britain was the big winner. Now Britain was literally in control of something like 15% of the world's surface, pretty much most of North America, India, of course. Yeah. So the Treaty of Paris ended the colonial theory of the war. It was less of a victory. Sir William Pitt, who had actually won the war, had been voted out of office. He and George III had quarreled. The Earl of Bute was responsible for the treaty negotiations. The English were now a true world power. Tell you what we're going to do. We're going to end there today. Okay? And we will finish this unit tomorrow. Yeah. All right. Talk about the American Revolution tomorrow. And I'm going to peace out. And yeah, we'll talk tomorrow. I have a stain right there. It's not a stain, it's a shadow. See? Anyway, bye for now. I will see you tomorrow.